speakers, and then we'll take it from there. So Rebecca Davidson is a manager of corporate data analytic at the Calgary Police Service. She has over 20 years of analytical experience in law enforcement, where she has worked as a tactical and strategic analyst as well as a business strategist. She participates on research, data, and analytics committees at the local, provincial, and national levels. Rebecca has a master's degree in sociology and has taught courses at Montreal University and Athabasca University. Katherine Murphy is the Executive Director of Legal and Regulatory Services at the Calgary Police Service. In this role, she oversees the services professional standards section, legal services, and access and privacy sections. Prior to joining the CPS, Katherine served as Chief of Staff and Corporate Secretary of the Canada Energy Regulator, CER, and in that capacity provided strategic and governance support to the organization's board of directors, CEO, and Indigenous Advisory Committee. Katherine has practiced law at the CER as Associate General Counsel and at 2 national law firms. Katherine holds an Honors Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Acadia University and a Bachelor of Laws degree from Dalhousie University. She volunteers as a board director with Influence Mentoring Society and with Aventa Center of Excellence for Women with Addiction. So the presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. Rebecca and Katherine, I'll leave it to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting us to this meeting. I feel very privileged to be with you and to share this presentation with you. I'm joined by my colleague Katherine, who probably is going to be much better positioned to be able to answer some questions from a sort of a legal perspective. But what I will do is I'll share the presentation, and then we'll probably take questions at the end if that works. Excellent. And I'm just going to make sure that I can share my screen with everyone and whether or not you can see. It's often the most difficult part. Oh. Are you seeing? Oh, sorry, wrong one.
Yes.
You're seeing it. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to turn off my camera, as I find it quite distracting to see myself. Okay. Make sure that this is, there we go. As you mentioned, this is a presentation on CPS race data that we just actually released within the last month publicly, but we have been working on this since 2020. And I cannot take credit for all this work. I work with an amazing team of analysts who have developed the methodology and done most of the work on this. So I do have to acknowledge all their expertise. So the presentation today, I will look at a brief history of race data and the current state, because it's quite different across different provinces. I'll also give you an overview of our systems and processes, which can often be a bit of a challenge to do this work. And then I will go into greater detail about how we did the work and what our findings are, and then the next steps. So historically, race data collection was considered inherently racist, and police agencies were actually reluctant to collect the information. They thought it would actually do more harm than good in making that data public, and there wasn't really any training around how to collect it or how to identify people of different races, etc. There were methodological concerns. There's no national standard. And the data was believed to be of poor quality if we were to go that way because of a lack of training and lack of standard. And we really did see sort of a shift where people have often said if it's not measured, then it's not important. And so I think for many areas, across Canada, they realized early on that they should be collecting this information because it informs understanding and allows you to track where you're making changes. So without the data, you can't really do much about addressing the concerns. So spurred on by human rights legislation in Ontario in 2018, they established the requirement for all police agencies to collect and report data only on use of force incidents. It took them 4 years to develop a standard and a methodology and a template to where they could actually report data in 2022. Following suit, British Columbia implemented an Anti-Racism Act in 2022, where across many sectors, they have recognized the importance of collecting race information, and now are building the structures and foundations and processes to collect that information. And I will just note, in Alberta, we have nothing that requires us to collect that information. So until July 15th, 2020, where, as I said earlier, stemming from the tragedy of George Floyd, both the CACP, which is the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, and Statistics Canada put together a joint announcement stating that we will collect and establish a standard across Canada for the collection of race information. However, there is a limit on that. It is only pertinent to what we call uniform crime reporting. So this data will only be collected for victims of violent crime and offenders of both property and person crime or violent crime. So it does not collect information or pertain to traffic and people who are victims of property crime, etc. So it's very narrow scope because Statistics Canada has established a consistency across Canada to collect only these variables so that they can do comparisons. And they also then use that information to create the crime severity index and other things that you may be aware of. So we collect information that is broader than the UCR, but these standards that Stats Canada are going to establish only pertain to that UCR component. And I'm happy to explain further if I did not make that very clear. So essentially, as you mentioned in my introduction, I am a member of this national committee that is working with jurisdictions across Canada to establish that national standard. But because, as you can imagine, this is a huge task, the Calgary Police Service didn't or wouldn't wait that long. We realized that we had information in our systems that we were able to analyze and put together what you will see in the findings. So we've kind of gone out ahead of the national standards, but we're also informing those standards with the work that we are doing. As the manager of a data analytics area, I recognize the importance of data. And I think obviously CACP, Statistics Canada, and others have realized that this data will help us foster relationships and build trust, because it'll create transparency and accountability. As I mentioned earlier, it will create awareness. We have right now assumptions of what that data would look like. So we really want to create some baselines and understanding that can be shared. And it will also help us inform strategic direction and decision-making at all levels of government. I mentioned our data systems and processes. So the Calgary Police Service and police officers work with many different systems where they're required to collect information. It may not come as a surprise to you, but unfortunately, none of the systems that they use are aligned in how they collect or label race data. So our RMS is a national system that not all police agencies use, but the vast majority do. And the pick list, as you can see, is quite narrow in terms of the number of options you have. It also is quite dated in its language. and it isn't necessarily logical, as there seems to be sort of granular detail on some areas of the world, but not others. CPIC is very basic. Traffic, we actually can't collect any information, and traffic is a provincial system. There is no data box to enter race information. And then we also have hate crime, which is managed by Statistics Canada in terms of the PIC list, that is very granular, but does not marry up with any other system. So this is one of the first, obviously, concerns that we're trying to overcome with creating standards, is that there's no one consistent area or reflective PIC list that is essentially intuitive, that is consistent, and that is reflective of current language. Calgary Police Service can certainly inform what these should look like, but we don't make the decisions. It is more of a national decision that we work with vendors. The other thing I wanted to mention was just around police processes. I don't know if you're like me, but I have watched my share of police programs on television. And within the hour, police have solved the crime. So they've made the arrest, they've solved the crime, and the person's going to jail. So this is a very simplistic way of sort of portraying what kind of discretion or police processes that people have, that we have. It does not reflect reality. We know that some investigations can take years and that we may never actually end up in court. I would argue that this is probably more reflective of what it looks like, but I would also say this is actually not complex enough. Obviously, there's decision points across the entire spectrum. It is convoluted, and it isn't as linear as people think. So we know that there's decisions to be made across the board here, and all of these different decision points can influence what the data looks like. So to get into more detail about what we actually did, we wanted to recognize what was important in doing this work. And first and foremost, we recognized that it was important to have community engagement. We have worked probably for the last 3 years engaging with the different community groups that we already have partnerships with at the Calgary Police Service and others. We have what we call a diversity unit here that have connections with sort of diversity boards. So we have youth boards, sexual diversity boards, and then people that represent different regions or parts of the world. And so we have engaged with them in terms of stating that this is what the Calgary Police Service is engaging in. We would like any guidance, insight, and feedback in terms of how to approach that. One group in particular that has been exceptionally helpful is our Indigenous Relations group, in terms of giving us insight in terms of how to express things, how to share findings, because some of these findings will create trauma. So they've been exceptionally helpful in building this approach. We also have gone in with the assumption that disproportionality does exist. We know through our crime data that it is not equally distributed across men and women. So we do not see a 50-50 split. So we do know that we're going to see that. We don't expect to see proportionality. So that was one concern that we had. Also, that because data mining was required. So obviously, police officers are not always the best at putting information in, or sometimes information doesn't exist. And so we have to go back into records to look to where we may have information on an individual to identify how that person was identified in a previous report. And I'll get into more detail after on this one, because it's probably not going to make much sense right now what I'm saying. The disaggregated versus aggregated data. We know that to be able to provide a more fulsome picture, we have to aggregate data to be able to provide insight into terms of trends and larger components of the research. We know that use of force data is not proportionate to our interactions. So we have tried to do a 5-year trending, but for most of the analysis, but unfortunately for the use of force data, we switched to a different system. So we do not have historical data at the ready right now. We are going back in and making that data set more fulsome. We also know that the analysis may not reflect what the community is expecting. So we know through the engagements that the community was very much interested in traffic stops. But as I mentioned earlier, that data is just not available because it is not collected. We also know that our data is limited. So as I alluded to earlier, the information that we have on race is actually based on officer perception. We do not currently ask people that we're interacting with what their race is. So what we have is officer perception, and we know that perceptions vary. So in our data, we know that I could put someone in as a particular race, and my colleagues may put them in as something else. So what we've had to do is go in and look for commonalities in terms of how someone was labeled, and then select that particular race for that individual. So if we saw that 4 times they were put in as Black and maybe once as white, then we know that there's a bit of discrepancy there. And so we would actually call them racialized. But if someone was identified as Inuit, Métis, or Aboriginal, we would see that there's a commonality there, and we would label them as Indigenous. So we use that methodology to create some consistency and to deal with the officer perception inconsistencies. We have based our analysis on the 2021 census. So you will see in the analysis that we have created proportionality. We have to do it based on a 21 census because we don't have more recent information. We would really love it if the city of Calgary would resurrect their census so that we had more timely information as opposed to relying on the census that's every 4 years with the federal government. We know that we have interactions that are with subjects or people that are not all from Calgary. So we may see that people have come into the city and we've had dealings with them. Those people would be included in our analysis. We have not done any statistical significance testing, so we cannot say whether or not our results are statistically significant. That will be done at a later stage. And we know that our analysis is descriptive and does not explain the why. We wanted to put this out as quickly as possible to inform those discussions. We want to be able to do deeper dives and engage more so with the findings that we have here to help develop a better understanding of the why and then the what's next. So there are 2 key statistical concepts that we have applied, and this is actually seen as baseline analysis. So it is the minimum level of analysis that you can do around looking at race data. And this was actually prescribed in Ontario's legislation. So we have followed suit in that regard. And so the 2 concepts are disproportionality, which is the state of being either under or overrepresented. And then disparity is the state of being unequal. And so the best way to understand this is probably through an example. We were able to look at the Calgary Homeless Foundation information, and we can see here that there is a difference in terms of the proportionality of those people that are living in the home, who are homeless. And we can see from their findings that those who are unsheltered, there is an overrepresentation of Indigenous, and those that are unsheltered and homeless are 40% likely to be Indigenous. So what we can see is we know that Indigenous represent a small proportion of our population in Calgary, but they are highly overrepresented in the sheltered and unsheltered homeless population. So essentially, we look at disproportionality as a ratio, and then we look at disparity to see whether or not there's differences in outcomes and how they're being treated within that group. We know that disproportionality and disparity may result from bias, from systemic issues, and other socioeconomic risk factors. So we know that, like the social determinants of health, there are also the social determinants of crime and involvement with police. So earlier or late last month, we released 2 reports. One is on the race data analysis, and the scope, we went broader than what Statistics Canada suggests. We've included information on missing persons, officer contacts, victims of violent crime, and offenders of violent and property crime. And then we also are looking at the use of force in a separate report. Please note that these will then, after this year, they will become annual reports, but they will continue to be separate, because what we want to do is we release a use of force report every year. We're going to tie our race data to that report to provide a more fulsome picture. So I'll give you an overview of the findings. And when we looked at missing persons, we can see right away that we have disproportionality. So we know that Calgary youths account for 7% of our population, according to our census. However, they represent 50% of all our missing person reports. We can also see, when we look at intersectionality, that female Indigenous youth who have a chronic history, so who go missing frequently, are most overrepresented as a group. When we look at disparity, so once they're in the policing system, once we're aware of these people missing, do we have differences in outcomes based on race? Our analysis would suggest no. Over 99% of missing persons are located within, I believe 24 to 72 hours are located irrespective of race. So just to take you through some of these graphics, if we were to have proportionality, we would see that these blue lines would all line up. But we can see here, with the census information here, that the blue represents the Indigenous population. It's 3%. But we can see here, they represent 36 to 24% of all our missing person reports. When we've shown this graph in particular to members of the Indigenous population, we've had people gasp, because it is so telling in terms of the disproportionality for Indigenous youth, for male and female. We can see here in this one in particular that female Indigenous youth are considerably overrepresented as missing persons. But here we can see, and the scale is quite small, we are finding people, irrespective of race, fairly consistently within that 1 to 2 days. Oops. Sorry, I don't know why my computer has just done something. When we look at officer contacts, so to give an example of what an officer contact is, officers are legally placed to talk to people. We often receive calls for service where the public has reported someone may have tried to break into their house. The person was wearing a hoodie and jeans and a baseball cap. Officers will be dispatched to that area to look for people that fit that description. They will potentially stop that individual. They do not have any evidence or suggestion that person may have done the crime, but they fit the description that was provided. So they're able to collect information on that individual and they enter it into an officer contact form. So when we looked at that information, we found that Indigenous subjects were overrepresented by both the public call for service that we would do or from officer initiated, where people are doing proactive work and may notice someone that doesn't quite fit, or that there's a description that they may match. We also looked at intersectionality, where we saw that compared to white females, Indigenous female subjects were 5 times more likely to be subject of an officer contact in 2018 and 14 times more likely to be subject of an officer contact in 2023. We know that these findings are driven by a lot of the proactive work that we and our partners did in the downtown area around the LRT. We have looked at the shelter information to find that there was an overrepresentation of Indigenous females staying in the shelters at that time. And because they can't stay there 24/7, they're often found at the LRT, etc. So we had engagements with these individuals, often to offer them supports to see how they were doing. And that is why we have that overrepresentation of Indigenous females in this particular category. When we look at victims of violent crime, we can find that Indigenous persons are 2.5 times overrepresented in our data. When we look at the intersectionality, we can see Indigenous females are 4 times more represented in assaults, 2.5 times in robberies, and 2.5 times more in sex offenses. Again, the first indicator to look at is, do these numbers line up? And we can see that they don't. We can see that the Indigenous population, like in here in the blue, the proportion they account for is much higher than their Calgary population, and we can see that across the board. When we look at offenders of both violent and property crime, we know that we're often dealing with the same people quite regularly. So 30% of the time we see repeat offenders. We see that Indigenous persons are 6 times and Black offenders are 2 times overrepresented in our offender population. And that males account for 75% of our offenders, and almost half of the offenders are white. So again, if we were going to see proportionality, we should expect to see 50% male, 50% female, and equal distribution for races, but we do not see that. We do know that we can see within the Indigenous population that we see overrepresentation, particularly around shoplifting and more property crime, whereas the Black population, we're seeing slightly more involved in more of the violent crime. When we look at use of force, it's a much smaller data set. I think it's 1 in, like, oh gosh, I can't remember, and maybe Katherine, you can remember. I can't remember the exact proportion where we actually have a use of force incident. It's like 1 in, or 0.14. Sorry, I should have been prepared for that one.
I think it's about 0.16, Rebecca. It's very small.
Yes, thank you. So this doesn't happen very often. So the data set is much smaller, but when we do look at that data, we can again find that Indigenous females and males are overrepresented 7 times and 4.5 times respectively. We see that Black males are also overrepresented, and racialized males and females were underrepresented. So I haven't mentioned what's included in racialized. So what we did, if you remember, we had, and I'll maybe just go back, and I apologize for this. I'm just going to quickly go back. Hope I'm not making you too dizzy. You see here that we have Black and white and Indigenous, and all the other labels that we have grouped them together as a racialized individual. And so it gives you an idea of how we're grouping the data. just quickly go back. So we can see actually that racialized males and females are underrepresented in use of force incidents. We did look to see whether or not there were differences or disparity in the types of use of force that we used. And we can see when we do this analysis, what we do is we compare the different groups to the baseline group, which is white. And for it to have any disparity, we have to see it considerably over or significantly over 1.0. And so our analysis would suggest that there is no disparity or no significant differences in the types of methods of force that we are using based on race. When we look at the use of force categories, we can see that they illustrate both over and underrepresentation. The racial composition of those arrested. So we wanted to see, is there disparity in terms of outcomes for the different races? So we looked at arrests, and we could see that when we look at the arrest population, it lines up much more equally than with the overall population. So we can see that the people that we are arresting align to the people where we're applying use of force. So the other way to say that is that we are applying, that the use of force is applied typically when there is an arrest that is occurring, and that those two populations line up. It does not line up with the population distribution. So what does all this mean in terms of the bigger, larger race data collection and reporting? As I said, we hope that data will inform change and provide insights. And in terms of some of the changes or the way it has helped inform some of the changes here, it has actually helped us reinforce a decision to hire an Indigenous missing person navigator. If you remember the graphs showing the overrepresentation of Indigenous population in our missing persons, this data has helped reinforce the need to be able to have someone with Indigenous understanding of the cultural nuances and the trauma to help us navigate with the public through these investigations. We also share this data with partners to help work toward broader understanding and to inform structural and systematic change. So we know that we need to be able to provide this data to our health partners, to our education partners, etc., so we can bring it all together and look at the entire spectrum of things to help drive bigger change across the board. In terms of next steps, so as we said, this is a much larger, so this is a part of a much larger journey. We know that we're not finished here, and we know that we have to marry this information up to give a bigger picture of what's occurring across society. So we're going to continue our dialogue and ongoing engagement with the community to better understand the path forward, but also to better understand what these findings actually mean. A lot of who we have shared this with has said, what's next? How will this inform your work? And so we are committed to using this information to look internally to see if there's policies, practices, behaviors, etc., that we can adjust to better reflect the diversity of our community and the practices that we lead. I will continue to work on the National Committee with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and Statistics Canada to provide them best practice in terms of lessons learned, etc., that we have learned from this process, and to encourage that engagement with communities throughout the way. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to continue to evolve the analysis that we've done here by looking at the 5 whys, continually challenging what have we found here, what can we do with this information, so that we can evolve and progress this understanding. And that is all I have to say, and I apologize, it was somewhat disjointed, but I do apologize. Hopefully you've got the gist of what we've been saying in terms of the report, but what I will do is happily take questions or explain things that I may not have explained very well. And I'm just going to stop sharing some concepts or things that may not be particularly clear from that presentation.
Who's going to manage the questions?
We can take the questions.
I already have two.
Okay,
My name is Linda, and I'm the former executive director of the Alberta Civil Liberties Research.
Yes, I think I talked to you on the phone.
We did.
Yes.
One question, and it has to do with my vision. You had that intricate chart. And I wondered if the crown was included. So you get the police decide whether or not they're going to do charges, because it's actually up to the crown whether they're going to proceed in these matters. Did you include that in your analysis or no?
We do not have the crown information. But maybe Katherine, did you want to jump in there or?
It is sort of included by reference in here, maybe not as overtly, but certainly decisions around release, bail, all of those steps would have Crown involvement at those stages.
Right.
It's in here, it's just not sort of its own junction point. We also do a lot of advisory work with the Crown. So on complex files, the Crown's often embedded with us right into the investigation. So they're kind of present throughout.
That's one. And the next question is a huge question. We at the Research Center are extremely interested in educating the public about these issues, the issues that arise from your report, and also the police. And we're wondering if we could work together with the police to start educating both the public and the police about the consequences of some of the statistics that you have come up with. Like, how would you take from an outside agency? We have worked with the police quite a bit, actually, but we're interested in educating the police about to understand what's happening, why it's happening, and what maybe they can do about it, both in the training and in the existing police departments. So what do you think?
I certainly think it's a possibility. I'm not going to say no, that's for sure. And we may be able to connect you with our racial equity office, who would have more of a role in the learning and the education piece, as well as the culture change internally. So
that would be awesome.
The organization.
We're really interested in that because we did help out a little bit with some of your research on racism and that. And we also met with, by the way, with the Edmonton police too, and talked to them. We're not interested in blaming anybody. We're interested in the power of education to make change. And we have my staff, not me particularly, but my staff have a lot of expertise in anti-racism, and we've been involved in this area for a long time, and we would love to share our knowledge and resources with you folks.
I also wondered, and I would also say, we wouldn't say no. Have you at all been engaged with Statistics Canada? Because I know that they engaged many different groups across the country for insight, guidance, etc. And one component that is a huge component is training. So I'm certainly happy to hook you up with the individuals that are managing that.
We haven't been involved. I mean, they send us data all the time, but they haven't asked us. Like, we even have some, and maybe I'll get Pamela to address this, but we have some concerns about the categories that you use. And it's nothing against you. It's maybe they need
As
to
do
be.
we, as do we. Yes.
We
Yeah.
have many concerns with the way,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it would be nice to be able to share those concerns with whoever, Statistics Canada or whoever.
And one of the reasons why Statistics Canada is so important is because these pick lists that we use come from the systems that we acquire from third parties, so our data systems. So we are
Right.
actually not, as CPS, at liberty to change those systems
No,
unilaterally. So we're hoping for a national standard that then is applied across the country. And it's taken years to even just work through this one issue around the lists that we use.
and I get it, you want some standardization across the country, right?
Right.
But of course, there's still interpretation. by
Absolutely.
the people who take the data, and maybe some of the things that we could help with is even for a police officer is, how do you take this data? Like, do you go up to somebody and say, what race do you see you're in? Or do you say, well, I think you're probably Indigenous, does that sound right? Or, I mean, that's really a difficult conversation to have with somebody. So anyway,
So
Well,
what is,
and maybe I can just comment on that a little bit because we have tried a few pilots in that respect. So it's a very difficult conversation to have, particularly when you're arresting someone. It's emotions are high. It's not really the time to
no,
ask someone about their race because actually it can be taken the wrong way and someone can
insulting.
feel that, why are you asking? Is this going to mean that I'm treated in a different way? But
Exactly.
we have looked at a few different ways of potentially piloting this. For example, I lead the professional standards section, which is the police complaints process. And we have started to collect race data from complainants in police complaints where it's after the fact and we're able to inquire at that point to help us understand. Or for example, at our arrest processing center, when there's some distance, a bit of time distance from the initial arrest. So we are looking at, but that is definitely, and Rebecca can speak more to it, a conversation that's happening with Statistics Canada because we recognize the limitations of officer perception. You can run a test, people perceive race all differently. But we also understand the limitations of trying to achieve self-identification as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's complex, but I mean, I understand the need for standardization, but also we have to recognize, and I'm sure you've noticed in looking at statistics from other jurisdictions, that the issues that they experience are different. So if you're comparing Nova Scotia to Toronto to Calgary, those are significant, or to Regina, those are significantly different. They're going to have different results for sure, because the nature of the problems and issues they face are different. So it's fascinating to do it. And by the way, congratulations on doing it.
Oh.
I was so excited to get that report. You have no idea. Anyway,
well, I really appreciate
let the
your
rest of you ask questions and I can stop talking.
I just wanted to follow up on comment from Katherine. So what Statistics Canada are proposing is that there's two boxes for race. One will be officer perception and the other one will be self-identification. They're suggesting that officer perception is mandatory and self-identification, due to what some of the dynamics of asking people that, would not be mandatory. And they're suggesting that police agencies can either opt in or opt out for both. But where it becomes a little bit difficult, which is why we've not, I think, landed on anything, is how do you analyze that data? Because there's concerns about if you do the comparison, they're never going to line up. And so it's the outcomes of the data collection that I still sitting there trying to figure out what will that mean for the findings. And Statistics Canada also haven't, and believe me, I've been pushing to find out what will their level of analysis be, because you're right, the distribution across Canada of the diversity is very different in each pocket. So do they look at everybody's data and sort of provide a national picture? But that doesn't really speak to what you have in your own jurisdiction. So I don't think they know quite what that analysis will look like and how it will inform the different levels of jurisdiction. And then what we do with that information. How do we operationalize it? How do we inform practices and procedures?
Mhm.
It's very, very complex.
Very, but it's so good that you've at least taken the first steps at not only analyzing data, but publishing it and being transparent about it, because I think people can learn something from that. So
We hope so.
I hope so too.
So I have a
it-
question in the chat box. It's from Sukrit. She's asking if you had a specific breakdown for methods of use of force used.
We do. Let me just go back.
We do.
Sorry, share my screen again.
It's partially included in the race data report, but we issue a use of force report annually, as Rebecca said, and it breaks down in great detail the different types of use of force. So in future, they will be married, which will be good, but I'll let Rebecca jump in there.
Maybe I don't have it. Here we do. So we've had to roll these up because the numbers are low, so we can't, so we have to aggregate to be able to see where trends are. And so what we do is we have sort of a continuum. We have physical methods and intermediate methods. And so you can, I'm just going to see if I can make it bigger. So we have both the count and proportion. And I would have to go back. Physical methods. I know it's in the report. I have to go back. I should have looked at that one. I apologize to see what would be included in that. I know it's in a different population, a different presentation, so I can go back and send that information. But what I can tell you is when we looked at it, we did not see any disparity or differences in the types of use of force used when we looked at race. So it was equally distributed and not concentrated on particular racial groups, if that makes sense.
And that would be the race data element. But if you look at our general use of force report, you can see trends and changes in types of use of force that are applied over time. Like, for example, this year, just as one example, our canine contacts have dropped significantly. So you can sort of see changes over time in the different types of use of force. So in future, when they're married up together, I think it will provide quite a bit of additional nuance to the annual use of force report.
Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I do have a question. Hi, my name is Evan Brunner. I am a program and policy consultant for the Human Rights Commission. I have a lot of questions, but I'm trying to narrow it down not to bogart time. So one of the big questions I have is because you did indicate that this information will be shared publicly. Is there, or what is the plan in place for sharing this with the general population as well as with Indigenous populations? Just because, like, not only like from a human rights anti-racism perspective, but as an Indigenous woman, that data is worrying for a number of reasons, but particularly because of like racism, deep-seated racism. A lot of people are going to look at that and say like, oh, Indians are always getting arrested. Like, I grew up in a very racist town. And so that is a big concern for me. Like, did the data collection follow OCAP principles? And is its dissemination to the public going to have those mitigating established circumstances, especially talking about systemic discrimination, particularly with the lack of trust that my community has with police?
Great questions. And yes, they are disturbing, these results. So we have shared publicly. It is on our website. We've done news releases, etc. So it has been shared. I think I was a little bit surprised that we didn't get more interest from groups and requests for more information. And maybe that will come later on. But it'll
probably come for me because I have so many questions.
It is out there in the public realm. Did it follow the OCAP principles? Not per se, But as I mentioned at the beginning, we engaged the Indigenous community as much as possible, particularly when we saw what the findings were. Unfortunately, people were not surprised by them.
Oh, no, they're not shocking at
No.
all.
They are not in terms of they're disturbing, yes.
Mhm.
What we want to do is, or what we're going to do is just, how do we monitor this? How do we show change? So by hiring that Indigenous missing persons navigator, are we going to see changes in the numbers? Or is it changes in the process where the experience or the service delivery has changed? So we've talked with actually a few people. Do we do a more qualitative study around, since this has been released, since we know the findings, since we put these positions in place, do people have a more respectful, interaction? Has it changed the behaviors and the way we interact? Maybe the numbers won't change, but what is the quality of those relationships? Are we seeing changes there? And that will take a bit of time, but I absolutely know what you're saying in terms of maybe we won't see big changes in the overall trend, but are we making differences at an individual level for their experiences? And we need to be able to pull that information in too. So I don't know if I'm answering completely your
Oh, it
comments.
makes, yeah, no, it makes sense because I think that is like a consistent, and of course, like I by no means speak for like every Indigenous person ever, but just like working in this area for so long, it's always worrying when a body that has so much power over like racialized communities in particular collects data that it potentially could be misused and misrepresented. And so like it's just always a concern that I have. So like I do really appreciate that there is like this thought and this depth going into it, because that hasn't always been done. And I do find it really helpful that it is actually being thought about and looked into.
I think that's partly why this has taken so long, and for other agencies to wrap their heads around this, is that they do know it will potentially be weaponized. It will potentially create bigger boundaries with community. And that's why that engagement with community is so key. We can't just do this on our own. If we just release this report without engaging the community and recognizing what it could do, I think that will be more harmful than anything else.
Rebecca, and I must say, Rebecca's being rather humble right now about her team's work. Had she not pushed this forward, we would still probably be in a place of analysis paralysis on this, because what we have in this report is a snapshot really of a portion of our criminal justice and social services systems, even so far as to say that the health system is implicated in here. And so there is a major role here in the police to look inwards to ourselves and to use these findings to address systemic racism in our organization. But there's a much broader conversation that needs to be had amongst the broader partners and systems that we interact with. So as we delve into the why, those are where those conversations are so critical. But we feel strongly at CPS that we had to start the process, because you could spin on these issues forever about when to do it, how best to do it. It's not the full story, it's not the context, and even the data here isn't representative of everyone's personal experience with police, which may be better or worse than what is showing up in this report. So we also recognize that data can be a bit dehumanizing when you look at it in this way. But it's so important as a foundation, and also to set an example of the importance of the transparency around the data. So hopefully other organizations can not be afraid of data, but make sure that it's contextualized appropriately when it's put out.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry, I have so many questions. When you say use of force, is this as reported by the person who's arrested or by the police?
It is by the police. They have to fill in a subject behavior officer response form. It is required when they apply use of force. It is in a different system that we then marry up to our records management system. Each officer involved has to put in a form. So we have all the information And we do, we look for compliance to make sure that where use of force, that we have a report. And so there are separate reports that are publicly released annually on that particular topic on the use of force.
And I would imagine if somebody wasn't happy about the way they were treated, some of them would complain, right, to you, to that department.
Catherine's area, yes.
I don't know if you'll be surprised to hear this, and my staff will back me up, but by far the greatest area of, like, we don't do any advocacy in terms of representing people, but the number of calls we get from the public are very frequently about interactions with the police and educating people about what to do, like if they're not happy about something that happened, what their rights are. And that's part of the reason why I was so excited to see that report, because it sort of confirms what we're hearing. And I thought you might like to know that it's not an abstract problem. It's people are saying, look, this happened, now what do I do? You know, so.
Yeah, and it's interesting, use of force makes up only about 4% of the complaints we receive from the public. So we get about 1,200 contacts a year from the public to professional standards, and about 4% of those involve use of force. The rest are a variety of things, mostly officers being rude and of just, you know, not following up on their investigations and things like that. But we know I don't necessarily think that's because it's not an issue. It could also be because of underreporting. And we know there's concerns around the perception of police investigating police for complaints. And we've supported for several years now the province's move to an independent complaint oversight body, which we are working with the province on now. The legislation has passed, and we expect that to be operational in about the start of 2026. So we've supported that from the outset on the recognition that we believe it will actually help confidence in the complaints
With public.
Yeah.
We actually wrote a report that the Department of Justice, or whatever, the Ministry of Justice in the provincial government used in writing that legislation. I was so excited that they actually read something we wrote and took our recommendations to heart. So that was exciting.
I'll just jump in quickly. Just what we've found through this work is that there isn't a good understanding of what use of force is. So we've had to have lots of conversations about 2 officers turning up at a call is not a use of force. So there's a bit of confusion around use of force and authority. And so that has actually been quite enlightening for us in terms of how we report this and how people will understand it, because people see a gap in that. But I think it's understanding what that concept actually means. So that has been very, very helpful. Sorry, I know you have another question, Martha McCannis.
Oh, okay. I know there's a button to push for raising your hand and I couldn't find it. I'm wondering, do you know if health services accumulates any of the information that you're talking about? Because just from anecdotal experience, I think emergency departments have a whole lot of statistics relating to the area you're looking at. Do they gather anything, health services?
So I know I've met with Alberta Health Services, and they were beginning to scope out how they would collect race data information. That said, they have done a lot of work with the Indigenous community, particularly up north. So those standards and processes are quite well in place. But looking at the broader racial sort of collection of data and categorization, I still think it's a work in progress. But yes, there would be a wealth of information in there. Same with education.
For sure. Thank you.
We have just, you know, as an interesting anecdote, we have some legislative challenges in this province around sharing of information because of privacy reasons between law enforcement and health authorities. And we have been, especially when we're dealing with issues like mental health and addictions crises, and, you know, where law enforcement becomes involved, but they're also very much involved with the healthcare system. And so we've been doing a bit of advocacy work around how can we still protect folks' privacy, because it's extremely important, and we don't want health information to be misused by law enforcement and or vice versa, to bias either of those systems. But it is really important to address these broader systemic issues that we're able to collaborate on our data.
I'm thinking as well, gathering data, if you could allow, if there were a mechanism for self-identification, that whole area of identification or of race or even gender, all these things are more fluid than, say, that used to be at least our
And
perceptions 20 years ago.
we've even talked about, you know, if your race was on your driver's license, this would not be a problem. Everyone would know your self-identification when you interacted with the police, but there are so many issues with that as well. So from a privacy perspective and concerns, so there's options and ways of making it more available in terms of self-identification so that you don't have to ask during every interaction. But obviously that would require significant consultation and consideration around something like that as well.
And the systems, such as our records management system, have to probably be a bit more nimble to catch up with where we are at society in a sort of societal discussion. So they're a little bit behind in that regard.
We have another question or statement, I should say, written by Julia. It says, are you ever getting blamed for making this data up in order to project certain part of the society in a negative light? Because it's not based on self-identification. There are a lot of words about it out there. Doesn't it feed those negative tendencies for police force? I would hate if this is the case, because the police is such an essential service. Anyone would like to comment?
I don't know if we've been blamed for making the data, but I do think we've had lots of questions about why officer perception and what that means and whether it's accurate and how good is our data. And I think Rebecca answered the question and has been very direct, and we have been publicly, that our data is not perfect for that reason. And we've had to try to reconcile it and mine it because we're all human and we perceive people in different ways. And it's not going to be entirely accurate, but it was what we have. And we felt that when it's presented and mined and aggregated in a way using enough data, that the trends that we're seeing are accurate. And that's what we want to focus on. So I know that perception might exist, and we're certainly aware of that.
Just to follow up, that's why we put right at the very beginning, this is a limitation.
Yeah.
We understand that, but we needed to move beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, the data doesn't represent the whole picture, right? And that's why there should be next steps.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think
any other questions?
one of the experiences I had, just in terms of looking at what terms mean when, where, and historically, in looking at ancestry, I was looking at my New Brunswick and Nova Scotia ancestors, and they said native. Native at that point meant native to New Brunswick, not native indigenous background. So even the class questions historically of name or ancestry or background are all just as elusive and unable to quantify or to record that data. It's just impossible.
Good point.
It is, and I think it's important as well that we don't get overly granular, because terms change over time, and that's not true just for race, but all types of intersectionality terms change and develop over time. And if we need to get to a place where we at least can run a data set in a way that's going to provide, again, those trends, recognizing that the terms we use are not going to reflect how every individual person identifies. Absolutely not. And they will become out of date over time, and we'll have to revise them. But the objective is that ability to have the data integrity as much as possible.
Thank you for still doing it.
You're welcome. And I think to add to the complexity, we'll have mixed race. And so how does someone identify in that regard, or how would someone perceive them? So it's going to become more complex, I think, as we become more and more diverse. I think there's one more question.
Yeah, I was told that Gada is raising her hand. Sorry, I cannot see on my screen.
That's fine. Thank you very much for this report. My name is Gada Sfer. I am interested in the next step that you're going to build based on the collection of data. How are you going to build the trust between the police force and these marginalized or racialized communities? Because there are programs across the country, like for example, in Quebec, there is a RÉSEAU program by the Chief of Police, Davidson. I'm pretty sure you have heard of it, where the police officer, not only based on their perception, they go interact with the community, try to build a trust with the community, try to get to know them better in order to reduce those kind of incidents and arresting people. What do you have in how you're going to build trust with the community based on this data, for example, or improve practices in any way? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question. It's a very big question. We have we're doing a lot of things. So we have an anti-racism strategic roadmap as sort of the strategy overarching everything. This data component is one piece of that, because I firmly believe, and on behalf of CPS, that transparency is required for trust. So we need to be able to communicate the truth of what we're seeing in our data to get to a place of dialogue and trust. We have a number of advisory boards. We have an anti-racism committee, but we also have a variety of other advisory boards from the community who have been helping us through that. We have recently launched a community mobilizer program here, where we're hiring folks from different communities to work within CPS and build bridges between CPS and the community. We're doing a lot of work in our complaints process, our professional standards process, to build trust. But again, I think trust comes back to relationships, and relationships are built on transparency, and on taking the time to understand, and collaborate and seek advice and make sure that that's reflected in our solutions. So there's I can share some documents in terms of the broader initiatives, but there's a lot going on here to address that currently.
I appreciate that.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for this important work that you're doing and all the great questions. My name is Sulin Bodnaresco. I work at the University of Calgary with the One Child, Every Child project, and I'm a settler, and I'm able to work in Indigenous education with pre-service teachers, and I also work in anti-oppression education. Well, I would love to hear a little bit more around the position that you're mentioning of Indigenous Missing Persons Navigator. I would just love to hear a little bit more.
Absolutely. I do know that they have an Indigenous background. I believe they've just been hired. They have a social work background, and they will be embedded within the missing person unit to obviously provide education and training for the people within that work area, but also for outreach, and then to deal with the families and to assist investigations. So to look for different avenues for investigative leads, and to help, I think, provide a little bit more context to those particular investigations for people, and then no doubt with follow-up. And to be able to, I think, build best practice and a more formalized approach to these types of investigations, and how we interact with the Indigenous community.
The missing persons area is a really interesting one, because as I saw in the slides, most people are found within 2 days. So our interaction is very short, but what we're seeing when we say chronic missing people, some of these youth are going missing 60 times a year. So it's very frequent, very repetitive. So the question is around the why. It's connecting youth with culturally appropriate support and with their community. And they may be running away from group homes. those types of things. So and we often see that because group homes have a legal requirement to report immediately, right? If they can't find someone. So that's where a lot of these calls and chronic calls come from. So the social work background is helpful to deal with the why and the connection into services.
So the question we have of the group homes is, why that? Are they not culturally appropriate? Are there things that the group home could potentially do a little bit differently because so many of the Indigenous youth females run away from there? So to take again that step back, why there? Why those particular youths? What is it about that structure? Or
if I can, if you don't mind, I'm sorry if I can just follow up. That's a huge amount of things to be asking the Indigenous Missing Persons Navigator to do. And is that a single person?
It is a single person, but it's a unit and it's an organization, because we will be involved with the data aspect of things. There's other investigators there, so it will be a team.
Okay, just my loving and kindness, seeing so many of my Indigenous relatives and colleagues and people that I love getting deeply burnt out and having such a hard time with this very, very difficult work. Like, please do make it an actual team and support them and wrap around, because that is so much to do.
We agree. And we same thing with our community mobilizers. We don't want them to feel responsible for the relationship with the community. The organization is responsible. And, you know, when we're looking at systemic racism, whether it's in CPS or within the system more broadly, you can't delegate that to one person. So it's about,
we say that, but it's happening.
I know. It's about it's about
an
organizational, but I mean, if we could have more, we would. It's a resource issue, but 100% we would, there's a need and a desire for more. And we're hearing that from the community as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Me again. So do you think that you'll eventually be looking at, Martha was asking about health. And I know that there's a huge intersection between the police and the mental health area, where the police are being asked to, where there's no place else for the person to go, the police get to deal with it. And do you think eventually they'll start looking at those issues as part of intersectionality and also just on their own?
Yes, I do. We're seeing some movement. I know there's lots of policy work, and obviously on mental health and addictions, the province, at the provincial level. So we would start to see that. We had the Navigation Center open in Calgary recently, which is basically a hub downtown where vulnerable people can go and have all the services in one room. Even things as simple as getting identification has been a huge improvement. So we're, yes. Is there a long way to go though? Yes, we've also just started, we call them action tables. It's a collaboration between the United Way of Calgary, CPS, and a wide variety of community services. And we've created a process where we're identifying high-risk individuals, vulnerable individuals that interact with law enforcement, often chronically. And we're able to bring them to that table and use a coordinated crisis response approach with their consent. So they can have services contact them within 24 hours. And we're seeing, this is just in the last few months, but we're seeing some significant successes where someone might have been interacting with the police hundreds of times a year to being totally gone and into services. So, I mean, it makes a massive difference. Yeah.
Match up with where they need to be.
Yeah.
I know I have personal experience, actually, not me, I'm fairly stable, but in my family, and like I always feel sort of uncomfortable even when the police are always called in, and it's actually not the appropriate resource for the people, but you're having trouble controlling the person or something and you need help, but the long-term solution is not the police, you know, and it must make them very frustrated when they come out and they're expected to do something about it, and when nobody else is available to help, right? It's a
That's
concern.
exactly it. A lot of these agencies are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And so it's those off hours that police are called in as the last resort. But we recognize we're not the right ones for those calls. Any other questions? I don't know if you all have a copy of the reports. We're certainly happy to share those with you, and I can follow up on the use of force methods because I've blanked on what the different categories mean, but I'm certainly happy to share those with you.
If there are no other questions, on behalf of all of us here, and you know that this is recorded, and so some people will have access to this if they couldn't make it today, so to get the message out there. I want to thank you so much for coming and doing this work that you're doing and opening the door to a discussion on it. And obviously, like you said, we could, you know, dive down and just analyze it and so on forever. But at least it's out there and hopefully can be used to inform better practices and positive information. And also, don't forget too, the community, hopefully seeing that you've done this work, will at least be vindicated a little. They will say, oh, okay, now they're aware that a lot of the people who disappear are from a certain community or whatever. Like at least it's not all bad news. It recognizes that you, as an institution, recognize that there are some challenges out there. So thank you so much. And I will be in touch with you in the future, and keep you apprised of the work we've done and some of the work we've already done on racism, that you can refer whoever you need to refer. It's all free, because we're not about charging. We just want the whole world to change. And thank you so much for coming today. And I'll try to put a link to your reports on our website. That would be useful, I think. So thank you. If we were in public, we'd all be clapping right now.
Well, we very much appreciate you inviting us and for the very thoughtful questions that you provided. And I am sure we'll be in touch again.
Well, thank you so much. It was lovely meeting you.
You too.
And seeing you on Zoom. So thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great
Bye-bye.
afternoon.
Bye.